So I'm scrolling through this thread about worst first dates, right? And someone mentions arranged marriages, which gets me thinking about how lucky we are to choose who we fall in love with. But then I start wondering, has that always been the case? So naturally, I fall down this Wikipedia rabbit hole at like 1 a.m. and I end up on this page about the Inca Empire. Now I thought I knew the basics. Big empire, Machu Picchu, conquered by Spanish, end of story. But buried in this article is this one sentence that it stopped me cold. It says the Inca government didn't just control your job, your crops, or where you lived. They literally assigned you a spouse. Like imagine getting a government notification that's basically congratulations. You're marrying Maria from the village over the mountain. Wedding's next Tuesday. Bring a llama for the feast. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, that's weird, but probably just how things worked back then, right? But then I kept reading, and here's what got me. Apparently some people said no, and that's when this whole thing gets absolutely terrifying. Because what happened to those people? The ones who looked at the most powerful empire in the Americas, and said actually, I'd rather choose my own partner, thanks. Grab some coffee or tea, because this story gets dark fast, and maybe dim the lights a bit. We're going back 500 years to a world where love itself was a form of rebellion. Picture yourself waking up in Cusco around 1450. The sun rises over the sacred mountains, just like it always has, but today feels different. Today is Inti Raymi, not just the festival of the sun, but the day the empire decides your romantic future, and you have absolutely no say in it. See, what I didn't realize, until I dug deeper, is that the Incas had turned marriage into a bureaucratic process. They didn't just stumble into this system, they engineered it. Think about the most organized, efficient government department you've ever encountered. Then imagine they're in charge of your love life. That's what we're dealing with here. You're probably around 20, if you're a man, 16 if you're a woman. Those were the standard ages. Any older, and you were considered, well, let's just say the state didn't like citizens staying single too long, and you've been registered. Oh yes, there were lists, since you were born. Your name, your family status, your skills, probably even your personality traits, all recorded on those intricate quipu. Those knotted string systems that served as their databases. The officials tracking you are called quipu kameoks, and they know everything about everyone in their district. They know you're a decent weaver, that your family grows good potatoes, that you're generally obedient, but occasionally talk back to your elders. They know which families have eligible daughters, which ones need sons-in-law to work their fields, which bloodlines the state wants to strengthen or dilute. Now here's where it gets really systematic. You're not just marrying another person, you're being strategically placed into the empire's social fabric. The Incas called their family groups alas, and these weren't just relatives hanging out together. These were economic and political units. Your marriage isn't about whether you and someone else get butterflies when you look at each other. It's about whether your combined households will produce more textiles, grow more crops, have stronger children to serve the empire. The ceremony itself, imagine the world's most impersonal wedding. You're standing in the main plaza with dozens of other couples who are meeting their spouses for the first time. A government official, not a priest, not a family elder, but essentially a civil servant, reads off pairs of names like he's assigning work shifts. Huanca, son of Cuya, you will marry Cori, daughter of Quispe. That's it. No, you may kiss the bride. No exchange of personally chosen vows, just state-sanctioned pairing. And here's the thing that really gets me. This wasn't some desperate measure during wartime or a temporary policy. This was how the Incas thought society should work, permanently. They believed that letting people choose their own spouses was inefficient, maybe even dangerous. Love was chaos. Passion was unpredictable. But arranged marriages, those served the empire's needs. The whole system was built on this concept called mita, their mandatory labor service. You already owed the state your work, your time, your crops, so why not your heart too? From the empire's perspective, there was no logical distinction between assigning you to build a road and assigning you to build a family with someone who'd strengthen the community. But what makes this even more chilling is how thorough they were. They tracked bloodlines to prevent inbreeding, sure, but also to manage genetics, like they were breeding livestock. They wanted to produce citizens with specific traits, stronger for labor, more intelligent for administration, more beautiful for religious ceremonies. Your marriage wasn't just about you and your assigned spouse. It was about the children you'd produce and how those children would serve the empire and your alus, your extended family group. They were complicit in all of this. They had to be, because if you refused your assignment, it wasn't just you who faced consequences. Your entire family group could lose status, land rights, even protection from the state. So even if your parents wanted you to marry for love, even if they'd found someone perfect for you in the next village over, they couldn't risk the collective punishment. The most terrifying part, it worked. For decades, this system produced stable communities, strong families, and loyal citizens. The Incas managed to convince an entire civilization that love was selfish, that personal choice in marriage was a luxury the empire couldn't afford. But of course, some people didn't buy it. And that's where our story really begins. So imagine you're that young person in the plaza, and you've just been assigned to marry someone whose name you heard for the first time 30 seconds ago. You turn to look at them. Maybe they're attractive, maybe they're not, maybe they look as terrified as you feel. But here's what's really messing with your head. Everyone around you is acting like this is perfectly normal. Your parents are nodding approvingly. Your alus are already discussing which plots of land you'll work together. And the state officials, they're checking names off their quipu, like they've just solved a logistics problem, which from their perspective, they have. Because what I started to understand as I dug deeper into this, is that the Incas had convinced themselves, and most of their people, that this system wasn't just practical, it was moral. They had this concept called Aini, which basically means reciprocity or balance. Everything in the universe, they believed, had to be in balance. The mountains gave them water, so they gave offerings back to the mountains. The sun gave them warmth, so they built temples to honor the sun. And relationships, well, those needed to be balanced too, but not between two people who chose each other. That was seen as selfish, unbalanced. Instead, marriages needed to balance the needs of families, communities, and ultimately the empire itself. Your personal feelings, those were just irrelevant, like worrying about whether a stone wants to be part of a wall while you're building Machu Picchu. I found this one account, and this is going to sound familiar to anyone who's ever been in a relationship where the families got along better than the couple, about a young man named Atuk, who was matched with a girl named Killer. The state records, translated centuries later, note that it was a beneficial arrangement, because her family had expertise in metalworking, and his family controlled good farmland, perfect economic synergy. But here's the heartbreaking part. Atuk had been secretly meeting with a girl from his own village for months. They'd been sharing meals, helping each other with work, probably falling in love the way humans have for thousands of years. But that relationship, it didn't serve the empire's expansion goals. It didn't create new trade connections or political alliances, so it didn't matter. Now the religious justification for all this is where it gets really sophisticated. The Incas worshipped Inti, the sun god, but they also believed their emperor was literally Inti's son on earth. So when the state assigned you a marriage, it wasn't just bureaucracy, it was divine will. The sun god himself had looked down from the heavens and decided you belonged with this specific person. Try arguing with that. Try explaining to your family, your community, your entire society that you know better than the sun god about who you should marry. They'd look at you like you'd announced you were going to flap your arms and fly to the moon. And economically, this system was brilliant in the most coldly calculating way possible. Every marriage created new households that owed labor to the state. Every child born from these unions was a future taxpayer, a future soldier, a future builder of roads and temples. The Incas weren't just managing people, they were breeding them, like you'd manage livestock, to produce exactly what the empire needed. But what really gets me is how they made it feel special. These weren't just administrative procedures, they were ceremonies, festivals, celebrations. They gave people new clothes, provided feasts, made speeches about how these marriages would strengthen the empire and honor the gods. They turned coercion into celebration. Most people went along with it. They had to let it. Their entire world was structured around this system. Some people looked at this machine of control and said no, even knowing what that would cost them. And that's when things got really ugly. So here's where my late night research really started keeping me awake. Because once you know that some people refused these marriages, you can't help but wonder, how do you even begin to say no to an empire? Like, what does that conversation look like? Picture yourself back in that plaza. Your name gets called. You're supposed to step forward, take the hand of your assigned spouse, and begin your new life as a productive unit of the empire. But instead, you just don't move. Or maybe you do move, but you step backward instead of forward, and suddenly, hundreds of eyes are on you, and the quipu is checking his strings like maybe he made a mistake. But you haven't made a mistake. You know exactly what you're doing, even if you have no idea what comes next. The most direct form of resistance was exactly that, just saying no, right there in public. And from what I could piece together from Spanish colonial records and oral histories, it happened more than you'd think. There's this account from a chronicler named Pedro Cieza de Leon about a young woman named Chuya who simply refused to approach her assigned husband during a ceremony in 1478. She stood there in front of everyone and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I will not be given away like a sack of quinoa." Can you imagine the courage that took? This isn't just defying your parents or your community. This is defying the sun god himself, at least according to everyone watching. But Chuya did it anyway, and apparently she wasn't alone. The fact that Spanish chroniclers noted these incidents suggests they weren't isolated events, but public refusal was basically suicide, social suicide at minimum, and often actual suicide by the time the punishments were done. So most resistance was quieter, more strategic. Some people simply disappeared before the ceremonies. They'd slip away in the night and head for the Purim, the wilderness beyond the empire's organized settlements. Now, surviving in the Purim was no joke. We're talking about the Andes Mountains, high-altitude terrain, where the wrong step could kill you, and the weather could turn deadly without warning. But apparently, some people preferred risking death from exposure or starvation to living a life they hadn't chosen. There were rumors of small communities of refugees hiding in remote valleys, people who'd fled everything they knew rather than submit to state control. And here's something that really struck me. Some people tried to game the system. They'd seek sanctuary in other aulas, essentially trying to disappear into different communities where the marriage assignments might not apply to them. It rarely worked long-term, because the quipu record keeping was too thorough, but it bought some people time to figure out other options, or time to hope the system might somehow change. Then there were the mamacona, the chosen women who served in temples and were supposedly celibate for life. Becoming a mamacona was one of the few acceptable ways to avoid marriage entirely, but it came with its own restrictions. You were essentially trading one form of state control for another. But for some women, serving the sun god was preferable to serving a husband they'd never chosen. What fascinates me is that there seem to have been informal networks helping people resist. Local Caracas regional leaders sometimes looked the other way. when people disappeared. There are hints in the records of families hiding resistant members, of communities collectively agreeing to forget that certain people existed when the marriage officials came around. I found this one story that just haunts me. A young man named Sinchi was assigned to marry a girl from a distant village, but he was already in love with someone else, a girl named Aya from his own community. The night before the ceremony, Sinchi and Aya both vanished. Search parties found their bodies weeks later at the bottom of a ravine. The official record listed it as an accident, but everyone knew what had really happened. They'd chosen to die together rather than live apart in marriages they didn't want. And that's the thing that keeps hitting me. Some people chose death over compliance. Let that sink in for a moment. The idea of being forced to marry someone against their will was so unbearable that jumping off a cliff seemed like the better option. How desperate do you have to be to make that choice? But not everyone who resisted died or disappeared forever. Some people became what you might call serial refugees, moving from place to place, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. They lived on the margins of society, working odd jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to be properly registered. It was a hard life, but it was their life. The most successful resistance, though, seemed to happen at the local level, where sympathetic officials or community leaders could quietly protect people. Maybe a Karaka would report that certain young people had died of illness when they'd actually just been hidden. Maybe families would claim their children were too sick to marry, buying time until the assignments changed. But all of this resistance came with a terrible cost, not just to the individuals involved, but to their families and communities. Because the Incas had designed their system to make resistance hurt everyone you cared about. And that's where the real cruelty of this empire reveals itself. Okay, so this is where the story gets really hard to stomach, because what I discovered next is that the Incas didn't just punish the people who refused marriage. They turned punishment into an art form designed to break not just individuals but entire communities. Let's go back to Chuya, that woman who refused to approach her assigned husband. What happened to her next is documented in those Spanish colonial records, and it's brutal. First, she was stripped of her place in her IOLU. Just like that, overnight, she went from being a contributing member of her community to being no one. Her family couldn't share food with her, couldn't let her sleep in their home, couldn't even acknowledge her in public without risking punishment themselves. But here's the really insidious part. The Incas knew that exile from your IOLU was worse than death for most people. Your IOLU wasn't just your family, it was your entire social safety net, your economic support system, your identity. Imagine being cut off from every person you've ever known, every place you've ever belonged. You become a ghost walking among the living. And the land rights, gone. In Inca society, you didn't own land individually. Your IOLU had use rights to specific plots, and those rights came with obligations to work, to share harvests, to contribute to community projects. No IOLU membership meant no land access, which meant no way to feed yourself legally. You could starve in the middle of fertile farmland, because you no longer had the right to work any of it. Chuya ended up doing what most exiles did. No, she became a Yanakona, essentially a servant with no rights, but not just any servant. She was assigned to work in the silver mines. And if you know anything about Inca mining operations, you know that was basically a delayed death sentence. The work was back-breaking, the conditions were deadly, and the life expectancy was measured in months, not years. But the psychological warfare was almost worse than the physical punishment. The Incas had figured out that if you make resistance hurt everyone around the resistor, most people won't resist. So when someone refused marriage, their parents lost status within the IOLU. Their siblings might find their own marriage prospects limited. Who wants to ally with a family that produces rebels? their extended family could lose access to better work assignments or ceremonial privileges. I found this account of a young man named Huascar, not the later emperor, just a regular guy with an unlucky name, who fled rather than marry his assigned wife. His parents were demoted from their positions as alu administrators. His younger brother was reassigned from skilled textile work to manual labor in the quarries. His sister was removed from consideration as a potential mamakona. 3 generations of his family paid for his one act of defiance. And that's exactly what the system was designed to do. It made resistance a selfish act that hurt innocent people. Can you imagine the guilt, knowing that your refusal to marry someone you didn't love had destroyed your little brother's future? Most people couldn't bear that weight. But it gets worse. The Incas also used public humiliation as a tool of control. People who resisted marriage weren't just punished quietly, they were made into examples. There were public ceremonies where resistors were stripped, beaten, and forced to declare their crimes against the empire and the sun god. Their heads were shaved, their clothes were burned, and they were marked with symbols that identified them as rebels for the rest of their lives. I came across this absolutely heartbreaking description of what they called marriage of shame. Sometimes, instead of exile or death, resistors were forced into marriages with other punished people, criminals, disabled individuals, others who had fallen from favor with the state. It was the empire's way of saying, "You didn't want the spouse we chose for you. Fine, here's someone even worse." These marriages were performed without ceremony, without celebration, often in public, as a form of ongoing humiliation. The economic punishment extended beyond individuals too. Communities that produced too many marriage resistors could lose their favorable status with the empire. Their tribute requirements might increase. Their young men might be drafted for more dangerous military service. Their access to trade routes or religious festivals might be restricted. The message was clear: police yourselves, or we'll make everyone suffer. And here's something that really got to me. The Incas kept detailed records of resistance. Those quipu didn't just track who was supposed to marry whom. They tracked who refused, who fled, who helped resistors escape. They were building databases of descent, and they used that information for generations. If your grandfather had refused an assigned marriage, that mark against your family could affect your descendants' opportunities decades later. Some people were sent to what were essentially labor camps in the most remote parts of the empire, places where the climate was harsh, the work was dangerous, and survival was never guaranteed. They called these places mitame settlements, supposedly for colonization, but everyone understood they were where inconvenient people disappeared to. You might survive, but you'd never see your homeland again. The isolation was probably the cruelest punishment of all. Humans are social creatures. We need community, connection, belonging. The Incas understood this and weaponized it. They created a world where loving the wrong person or refusing the right person could cut you off from every human connection you'd ever known. And the thing that keeps me awake at night, this system worked. The fear of these consequences was so overwhelming that most people complied, even when their hearts were breaking. The Incas had created a machine that could crush human spirit while maintaining the illusion that they were building a harmonious society. But even in this darkness, resistance continued, because apparently, some things are worth risking everything for. But here's what the Incas didn't count on. Humans are incredibly stubborn when it comes to matters of the heart, and the more I dug into this, the more I found evidence that their perfect system was actually riddled with cracks, held together by fear more than genuine acceptance. The most common form of hidden resistance was what people today might call emotional affairs, except these were relationships that should have been marriages if the world had been different. People went through the motions of their assigned marriages, but they found ways to maintain connections with the people they actually loved. Secret meetings during market days, passing messages through trusted friends, stolen moments during religious festivals when movement between communities was more common. I found this account buried in a Spanish missionary's journal about a woman named Itzel who had been married to a potato farmer but was still in love with a metal worker from her original village. For 15 years, she managed to visit him every few months under the pretense of trading textiles. They never ran away together. The consequences were too severe, but they kept their relationship alive in these tiny stolen pieces of time. When the Spanish arrived and the old system started collapsing, they finally married. She was 32, and it was the first wedding of her life that she actually wanted. What's fascinating is how some local leaders, the Caracas, started quietly subverting the system. These weren't high-level officials in Cusco. These were the people who actually knew their communities, who saw the real human cost of these policies. Some started losing records of eligible young people, claiming they died of illness or moved away. Others would delay reporting marriages that didn't take place, buying time for people to figure out alternatives. There's this incredible story about a Caracas named Amaru, who basically ran an underground railroad for marriage resistors. He'd arrange for young people to be temporarily assigned to work projects in distant villages, where they could disappear into new communities under different identities. The central authorities never caught on, because his record-keeping was so meticulous in every other way. He protected dozens of people over the years, and the Spanish only found out about it when they interviewed elderly villagers decades later. And here's where it gets really interesting. The system wasn't enforced equally everywhere. The farther you got from Cusco, the more flexible things became. In remote mountain communities, local traditions sometimes trumped imperial mandates. Some regions had secretly maintained older marriage customs alongside the official system. Parents would hold private ceremonies for couples they actually wanted to see together, even if those couples were officially married to other people. The coastal regions were especially resistant. The Chimu and other conquered peoples had their own marriage traditions that went back centuries, and they found ways to blend those traditions with Inca requirements in ways that preserved more personal choice. The Incas knew about this, but often looked the other way, as long as the communities met their tribute obligations and didn't openly rebel. But what really started undermining the system was generational change. The children and grandchildren of conquered peoples grew up under Inca rule, but they also heard stories from their elders about how things used to be. These stories created a sense that the current system wasn't natural or inevitable. It was just the way things happened to be right now. And then of course the Spanish arrived, and everything changed overnight. Suddenly the people enforcing marriage assignments were dead or fled. The quipu records were scattered or destroyed, and entire communities were left to figure out their own social structures. Many people took advantage of this chaos to finally marry the people they'd always loved. The oral traditions that survived Spanish colonization are full of these stories. Couples who waited decades for their chance, families who kept forbidden relationships secret through generations, communities that collectively agreed to forget the old imperial rules. The Spanish missionaries were often confused by the complex relationship dynamics they encountered, not realizing they were seeing the remnants of a resistance movement. What strikes me most is how these stories were preserved at all. In societies where most knowledge was passed down orally, the fact that people kept telling these tales of forbidden love and secret resistance means they mattered. They weren't just historical curiosities. They were proof that even the most totalitarian system couldn't completely crush the human desire for choice in love. The Inca marriage system lasted maybe a century at its peak, but the stories of people who resisted it, those have lasted 500 years and counting. That has to mean something about which side of this struggle was really stronger in the end. So what does all this tell us about power and control? Because the more I thought about the Inca marriage system, the more I realized it wasn't really about marriage at all. It was about something much more fundamental, the question of whether individual human desires have any place in a perfectly organized society. The Incas had essentially figured out how to make people complicit in their own control. Think about it. They weren't just forcing people into marriages through violence or terror. They were convincing entire populations that choosing your own spouse was selfish, disruptive, even immoral. They made personal autonomy feel like a character flaw, and that's terrifyingly sophisticated. Any empire can control people through fear, but the Incas figured out how to control people through ideology. They made their subjects believe that the empire's needs were more important than their own hearts, that efficiency was more valuable than love, that social stability was worth sacrificing individual happiness. Sound familiar? I'm not trying to draw direct parallels to any specific modern government, but the techniques are recognizable. Control the narrative about what's selfish and what's virtuous. Make resistance seem like betrayal of the community. Create systems where individual defiance hurts the people you care about most. Make compliance feel like moral duty. What archaeological evidence we have supports this psychological approach to control? We find elaborate ceremonial sites where these marriage assignments took place, suggesting they were treated as sacred events, not administrative procedures. We find standardized housing units clearly designed for the nuclear families this system was meant to create. We find quipu remnants that show the incredible detail of their record keeping. They weren't just tracking marriages, they were tracking the entire social fabric of the empire. But we also find evidence of resistance that the official records never mentioned. Hidden chambers in houses that suggest people were concealing family members. Burial sites where couples were interred together despite having no official connection in the marriage records. Art and textiles with symbols that may have been coded messages between separated lovers. The human cost of all this control is almost impossible to calculate. How many people lived their entire lives married to strangers? How many died alone in exile, rather than submit to forced partnerships? How many families were torn apart by a system that claimed to be building stronger communities? But here's what really gets me. This system worked until it suddenly didn't. For generations, most people accepted that this was just how the world operated. Then the Spanish arrived, the central authority collapsed, and within a few decades, the entire marriage control system had vanished. People went back to choosing their own partners, like they'd been doing it all along, which suggests that maybe the system was never as stable as it appeared. Maybe it was always held together by a combination of fear, habit, and the absence of alternatives. The moment people saw that different ways of organizing society were possible, they abandoned the imperial marriage system without looking back. That's both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because it shows that even the most comprehensive systems of control can collapse quickly when people stop believing in them. Terrifying because it shows how completely a system can dominate people's lives while they're trapped inside it. The Inca Empire fell over 500 years ago, but questions about individual freedom versus social control haven't gone anywhere. We're still figuring out the balance between personal autonomy and collective good, still arguing about whether individual desires matter when they conflict with broader social goals. And we're still telling stories about people who chose love over safety, who risked everything for the right to make their own choices. And that's where I had to close my laptop last night. Because sitting there at 3 a.m., reading about people who died rather than marry strangers, I kept thinking about how we take for granted the most basic human freedom, the right to choose who we love, I mean, we complain about dating apps and ghosting and how hard it is to find someone compatible. But imagine if your biggest relationship problem was that the government had assigned you to marry your neighbor's cousin based on agricultural productivity projections. Suddenly swiping left doesn't seem so bad, right? But what really haunts me is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. Most Incas genuinely believed this system was better than letting people choose for themselves. They'd probably look at our dating culture and think we're absolutely insane. All this chaos and heartbreak and inefficiency when we could just have experts make optimal matches based on data. And honestly, sometimes when I see friends struggling through terrible breakups or staying in relationships that clearly aren't working, I wonder if the Incas had a point about the messiness of choice. But then I remember Chuja standing in that plaza, refusing to take a stranger's hand. I remember Sinchi and Aya choosing death together rather than life apart. Love might be inefficient, unpredictable, sometimes destructive, but it's ours to mess up. And every time we swipe right, or ask someone out, or decide to move in together, or break up, or try again, we're doing something that people died for the right to do. That's worth staying up until 3 a.m. thinking about, don't you think?